Welcome back to Inkwater Tales. Tonight's stories are old ones. 6 tales from Vietnam, a country of slow rivers and patient mountains. A wife who waited so long, the mountain kept her. 2 brothers and the tree that grew between them. A voice in the forest that never stopped calling. A gentle spirit who lives beneath the river. A turtle who once carried the fate of a kingdom. And a man who flew to the moon, holding on to a tree. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the water settle. Tonight's first story comes from the mountains of northern Vietnam. In the far north of that country, near the border, there is a province called Lang Son. It is a land of limestone mountains, old mountains, soft gray peaks that rise out of the morning mist like the backs of sleeping animals. Rivers move slowly there. They have nowhere to be. They wind between the hills, past small villages, past banana trees and bamboo fences, past temples with mossy roofs. And on one of those mountains, high on a ridge, where the wind is quiet, there stands a stone. It is shaped like a woman holding a child on her hip, a woman looking out, far away, toward the horizon. Travelers have seen her there for 1,000 years. The rain has worn her shoulders smooth. Moss has gathered at her feet, soft and green, like a blanket the mountain pulled over her. The people of Lang Son call her Hon Vong Phu, the waiting wife, the stone that watches for a husband. This is her story, the way the old people used to tell it. In one telling, long ago, before the stone was a stone, there was a small village at the foot of that mountain. It was an ordinary village. Thatched roofs, a well in the center with a rope worn soft from years of hands, chickens in the dust, a river at the edge, where the women washed clothes in the early light and the children caught small silver fish in their palms. In that village lived a young woman named Thi. And Thi was married to a young man who loved her quietly and completely, the way the river loves the valley. They were not rich. They had a small house with a dirt floor, swept clean twice a day. They had a rice field, green in the growing season, gold at the harvest. They had one water buffalo, old and patient, who liked to stand in the shallows of the river in the afternoon heat. And they had a son, a small boy, just learning to walk, who laughed at everything, at the rain, at the buffalo, at his own hands. In the evenings, when the cooking fire was low, the husband would sit in the doorway and play a bamboo flute. Soft, wandering tunes, tunes with no beginning and no end. And Thi would sit beside him with the boy asleep in her lap and watch the last light leave the mountain. It was a small life, but it was whole. Then one spring, word came up the river. There was trouble in the north. The king was calling men to the border. Every village was to send its share. The husband's name was on the list. There was no anger in the house that night, no shouting, only quiet. The kind of quiet that settles on a room when something large and slow is arriving, and everyone can feel it, and no one can stop it. He left on a gray morning before the mist had lifted. He carried a cloth bundle, rice, a knife, a warm shirt she had mended twice. At the edge of the village he turned around, one time, and looked at her standing in the doorway with the boy on her hip. He said, "Wait for me. When the war is over, I will come home along the river road. Watch the river road." And then the mist took him, the way mist takes everything in that country, gently, a little at a time. At first, waiting was easy. There was the field to tend, the buffalo to water, the boy, growing, always hungry. Spring became summer. The rice came up green and thick. Thee worked with the other women, and in the evenings, she sat in the doorway where her husband used to sit, and she watched the river road. Sometimes travelers passed, a salt merchant, a monk with a straw hat. Each time, her heart rose a little and settled again, like a bird that lifts from a branch and returns to it. Summer became autumn. The rice turned gold and was cut, and a field stood empty under the wide sky. No word came from the north. That is how it was in those days. A man went away, and the distance simply closed behind him, like water behind a boat. There were no letters for people like thee. There was only the road, and the river, and whoever appeared on it. So she watched. Winter came, with its thin rain. She wove baskets by the fire and taught the boy the names of things: tree, buffalo, father. The boy pointed at the flute on the wall and asked in his small voice what it was. She took it down and put it in his hands. She said, "Your father will teach you when he comes home along the river road." A year passed, then another. The boy grew tall enough to fetch water. The buffalo grew older and slower, and stood longer in the shallows. The mended shirt she had made her husband. She made another like it, a larger one, and folded it in the wooden chest, so it would be ready. And every evening, every single evening, thee climbed a little way up the mountain behind the village. There was a place there, a flat gray rock on the ridge, where the whole valley opened out below. The river, silver in the last light, the road beside it, thin as a thread. From there, she could see anyone coming, long before they arrived. She stood on that rock with the boy on her hip, while he was small enough to carry. And when he grew too heavy, he stood beside her, holding her hand. The villagers below grew used to the sight of her. A small figure on a ridge, still as a heron, facing north. There she is, they would say, without needing to look. There is thee, watching the road. The seasons turned around her like a slow wheel. Rain and harvest, mist and moon. The years did not announce themselves. They simply gathered, quietly, the way moss gathers on the temple roof. Now, here is the part of the story where the old people would lower their voices. Not out of fear, out of respect, the way you lower your voice in a temple or near someone sleeping. One evening, at the end of the dry season, Thee climbed to the rock as she always did. The boy was nearly grown by then. He had planted the field himself that year. But that evening he was a small child again in her arms, in the way that memory arranges things. And she held him on her hip, and she faced the north, and she watched the river road. The sun went down. The valley filled with blue shadow, like a bowl filling with water. One by one, in the village below, the lanterns were lit, small and warm and far away. And Thee did not come down. The wind moved over the ridge, very softly. The mist came up from the river, the way it always did, and wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. And where a woman had been standing, holding her child, watching the road, there was now a stone. Gray and calm, shaped exactly like her. A woman, a child, a gaze fixed on the horizon. The old people say the mountain did it, that the mountain had watched her wait, evening after evening, year after year, and had come to love her patience, and could not bear for it to be interrupted. So the mountain made her waiting permanent. It took her faithfulness and kept it. Safe from time, safe from weather, safe from forgetting. She has stood there ever since. Dynasties rose in the south and fell again. The war she waited on ended, and other wars came, and ended too, and were forgotten. The village at the foot of the mountain is still there. Different houses now, different names, but the well is in the same place, and the river takes the same slow turns. And on clear evenings, the people who live there now can look up at the ridge and see her. The waiting wife, Han Vong Pu, still holding her child, still facing north. The rain has made her edges soft. Swallows rest on her shoulder in the spring. Sometimes a traveler climbs up and leaves a stick of incense at her feet, and the thin smoke rises past her face and bends north and disappears. She is not sad, the old people say. Stone does not grieve. Stone only remembers. And there are worse things to become than a memory of love, standing in the high wind, watching a quiet road. The valley below her is sleeping now. The lanterns are going out, one by one. The river moves in the dark, saying the same soft word it has always said. She keeps her watch, so no one else has to. But the river of that country keeps more than one story. Further south, in a village of areca palms and battle vines, there were once two brothers who looked so alike that even their own teacher could not tell them apart. And that story is next. Further south, in a warmer province, where the rivers run wide and slow, and areca palms grow tall and thin along every lane, there is a reason why, in that country, a wedding is not complete without a green leaf, a nut, and a little lime paste. It goes back to two brothers. In one telling, there once lived a father who had two sons, born so close together and so alike that even he sometimes paused before calling their names. The elder was called Tan, the younger Lang. They shared a face, they shared a laugh, they shared, it was said, a single shadow when they stood close together in the evening light. Their father sent them both to study with an old teacher who lived across the river. And in that teacher's house, there was a daughter. Her name was Uck. She was kind and quiet, and she noticed before anyone else did the small things that told the brothers apart. The way Tan paused before he spoke. The way Lang always let his brother eat first. In time, Uck came to love Tan, the elder. And Tan loved her back, gently, the way a lamp loves the dark it sits in. They were married. Lang did not leave. There was room enough in the house for three, and love enough, it seemed, for three. Lang helped with the harvest. Lang mended the fences. Lang sat with them in the evenings, and if anything, it was hard to say where the brothers' bond ended and the marriage began. Now, because the brothers were so alike, there came, one evening, a small and honest mistake. Uck, in the dim light of dusk, coming in from the well, took Lang's hand for a moment, thinking him her husband. It was nothing. A heartbeat's confusion, corrected the moment she saw his face clearly. But Tan, arriving home just then, saw only the shape of it, in the failing light, his wife's hand in his brother's. He said nothing that night, but something small and cold had entered the house, the way a draught enters through a door that does not quite close. Lang felt it. He did not know what he had done, only that his brother's laugh had changed, grown thinner, and that Tan no longer met his eyes over the evening rice. A brother who has shared everything, a face, a shadow, a childhood, can feel a distance long before he understands its shape. So one gray morning, before anyone woke, Lang gathered nothing. No bundle, no bread, no plan. He only walked. Out of the village, along the river, not knowing where the walking would end, only that he could not stay and be the cause of his brother's altered laugh. He walked until the village was far behind him, until the river grew wide and strange, until he came to a place where the water met a great empty plain, and could walk no further. There, exhausted, and hollowed out with a grief he could not name, he sat down against a gray stone by the water's edge. And there, quietly, the way a candle simply stops, he died. The old people say the stone did not want him to be alone, so it drew him in, gently, and became, from that day, a little larger, a little more shaped like a boy who was tired of walking and only wanted to rest. When Lang did not return, Tan understood, all at once, the shape of his own mistake. A shadow of jealousy, and nothing more, had driven away the other half of himself. He set out to find his brother, along the same river, past the same bamboo groves, and he did not stop, though his feet grew raw and his voice grew hoarse from calling a name that the wind simply carried away. He came, at last, to the same wide plain, the same gray stone, and he sat down beside it, too tired and too sorry to go on, and he wept quietly, the way rain falls when there is no wind to hurry it. And there, beside his brother's stone, Tan closed his eyes and did not open them again. But the mountain, once more, did not want a grief to simply end in the dirt. From the place where he sat, a tree began to grow, tall and straight and slender, reaching up and up, as if still trying to stay close to a brother who had gone ahead. An areca palm, the first areca palm anyone in that country had ever seen. Cuckoo came looking last of all. She followed the same river, asked the same questions of the same fishermen, and found, at the edge of the same wide plain, a stone and a tall new tree growing beside it, and no husband and no brother-in-law anywhere at all. She understood, the way a wife understands things without being told. She sat at the foot of the tree, and let her grief settle over her like evening mist, and she, too, closed her eyes for the last time. From where she sat, a vine grew. Thin, green, and searching, it wound its way up the trunk of the areca palm, wrapping around it gently, the way a hand finds another hand in the dark. A beetle vine, reaching at last and forever for the husband it had lost. It is said that a king traveling through that province many years later stopped to rest beneath that very tree. He heard the story from an old villager and was moved by it, moved enough that he tried, himself, chewing together a leaf from the vine, a piece of the nut from the tree, and a little lime from the stone, ground fine. And he found that the taste of the three together was warm and sharp and good, and that alone, each was only a leaf, a nut, a stone. But together, they were something else entirely. From that day, in that country, no wedding was complete without the three joined again. A leaf, a nut, a little lime. A brother, and the wife who loved them both without meaning to cause any harm. Reunited finally, in the one way grief could not undo. The stone still sits by that wide river, if you know where to look. The tree still grows tall and straight above it, and the vine still climbs patient and green, exactly as it always has. Not every voice in that old country falls silent when a story ends. Some voices are kept. Deep in a forest, further inland, there is a small brown bird that calls out every evening just as the light begins to fail, and no one who hears her has ever forgotten the sound. That story is next. If you walk through the forests of Vietnam in the last hour before dark, you may hear a single call. Cuok, cuok. Low and hoarse and endless. A small brown bird, rarely seen, always heard, calling the same sound over and over as the light fades. The villagers call her Chim Cuok, the cuckoo. And in one telling, she was not always a bird. Long ago, in a house at the edge of a great forest, there lived a young bride, newly married into a large family she barely knew. Her husband was kind, but often away, working the far fields with his brothers, gone from before sunrise until well past dark. His mother, the elder of the house, was a stern woman, not cruel exactly, only tired and quick to blame, the way people sometimes are when they have carried a household on their back for too many years. The young bride tried hard to please her. She rose before the roosters. She swept the floor twice. She carried water from the well before the mist had even thought of lifting. But in a house with many hands and only one pair of eyes to watch them, small things went missing. A basket, a hen, a measure of rice, unaccounted for. And each time, without meaning to, the mother's eyes found the young bride first. One evening, a small clay jar of rice wine went missing before a family gathering. It was nothing valuable, only enough for the elders to share a toast. But the mother, embarrassed in front of her guests, turned to the young bride in front of everyone and said words that were not kind and were not entirely fair and could not be unsaid once spoken. The young bride said nothing in her own defense. In that house, in those days, a young wife did not argue with her husband's mother, however unfair the words. But something in her, something quiet and patient that had bent and bent for months, simply could not bend any further. She waited until the house was dark and everyone was sleeping. Then she walked out, past the well, past the rice field, into the trees at the edge of the forest, meaning only to sit somewhere quiet until the hurt had passed. But the forest at night is larger than it looks in daylight. The path she had walked 100 times in sunlight looked like no path at all in the dark. Every tree looked like the last one. Every direction looked like every other direction. She called out, hoping someone from the house might hear and come looking. No one came. She called again, walking now in circles she could not recognize as circles, her voice growing smaller and more tired with each hour. By the time her husband returned from the far fields the next evening and learned what had happened, and ran into the forest, calling her name, until his own voice broke. She was already too deep inside it, and too lost to find her own way back to the sound of anyone who loved her. The old people say the forest heard her calling long after her strength had gone. And the forest, like the mountain, like the river, could not bear for a voice so full of longing to simply go silent in the dark. So it did not let her voice end. It kept it and gave it wings, small and brown and quick, so that the calling could continue. Not out of sorrow, the old people insist, but out of a kind of stubborn hope that refuses to stop, even now. Cuok, she calls every evening as the light begins to fail. Cuok, cuok. Some say it is a name. Some say it is simply the sound of someone still trying to find her way home, checking every single evening whether tonight might finally be the night someone answers. Her husband, in this telling, searched the forest every evening for the rest of his life. He never found her. But he said, often in his old age, that when he called her name into the trees, he always heard something answer. Not words, only a low, familiar sound from somewhere just out of sight that seemed to know exactly who was calling. You can still hear her in the forests of that country in the last hour before dark. Cuok, cuok. Not sad, the old people insist. Only patient, still calling. Still hoping that this particular evening might be the one where the calling is finally answered. Not every voice that outlives the body belongs to the forest, or the mountain, or the tree. Some belong to the water. Further south, along a slow green river, there is a spirit the villagers speak of only in whispers, though she has done nothing in 100 years to earn their fear. And that story is next. In the countryside of Vietnam, there are rivers that people still speak of carefully. Ma Da, they call the spirit that lives beneath the surface. In most tellings, she is spoken of as a warning, a shape in the water that pulls the careless under. But there is an older telling, from the villages along one particular bend of river, south of the capital, where the story is gentler and quieter. And the old people insist closer to the truth. Long ago, in one telling, there was a young woman who lived in a house by that river. She was not unhappy. She simply loved the water more than most people do. She swam in the early mornings, before the mist lifted, when the surface was still and gray, and the world had not yet decided to be loud. She knew the river the way some people know a room they have lived in their whole lives, where the current pulled gently, where it pulled hard, where the cold pockets hid beneath the warm ones. One evening, in a season of heavy rain, the river rose higher than anyone remembered. She went down to check the boats, to pull them further from the water's reach. And the river, swollen and unfamiliar even to her, took her before she understood it had changed. The village mourned her for a season. Then, as villages do, they slowly went back to their lives, and her name was said less and less, until it was said only by her mother, and then not at all. But she did not truly leave. The river, in this telling, did not take her out of cruelty. It kept her the way a mother keeps a child close on a cold night, because it could not bear for someone who loved it so completely to simply be gone. So she remained beneath the surface, in the slow green light that filters down through moving water. And there, with nothing else to do through the long centuries, she began to watch over the river she loved. When children waded too far, and the current began to pull at their small legs, they would sometimes feel, quite suddenly, a gentle push toward the shallows. Nothing dramatic, only a soft turning, as if the water itself had changed its mind about them. When a boat began to drift toward the rocks in the dark, fishermen would sometimes feel their oar catch a current that was not quite natural, one that nudged them safely past. The villagers who lived closest to the water began to notice these small kindnesses. But because they could not see her, and because the old warnings about Ma Da were louder than any new story, they gave the safety a frightened name. They said, "A spirit lives there. Do not swim after dark." They were not wrong that she was there. They were only wrong about why. There is one telling of a night when she was almost seen for what she truly was. An old fisherman, out later than he should have been, lost his footing on the wet bank and slid into the water in the dark, the current already pulling him toward the deep channel where the river ran fastest. He was old and tired, and for a moment he simply let the water take him, too weary to fight it. But something held him. Not dragged him down, as the old warning said such things would, held him, up, gently, the way you might hold a sleeping child's head so it does not fall. He felt, or thought he felt, in the moment before the shore, a shape beside him in the water. Not frightening, sad, somehow, as though whatever was helping him had wanted, for just a moment, to be thanked, or simply seen. He reached the shallows. He lived. And when he told the village what he had felt, most of them shook their heads and said the river had simply been kind to him that night, the way rivers sometimes are. But a few of the older women, the ones who still remembered a story their grandmothers had told them, only nodded quietly and said nothing at all. She is still there in this telling, beneath the surface in the green-gray light, watching the boats, turning the current just slightly when a child wades too far. She does not mind, they say, that the village fears her rather than thanks her. A river does not need to be understood to keep flowing the way it flows. And love, the old people say, does not always need to be recognized to keep doing its quiet work. So if you find yourself one day beside a slow green river in that country, and you feel the current turn a little kinder than it should, you need not be afraid. You are only being watched over by someone who loved the water enough to never really leave it. Not every guardian in that country's waters is quite so quiet, or quite so small. In the heart of the oldest city, there is a lake so still, it looks like a sheet of dark glass. And beneath it, the old people say, something far older than any spirit still keeps a very old promise. That story is next. In the heart of the oldest city in that country, there is a small lake, ringed by old trees, that the map calls Hoan Kiem, the lake of the returned sword. By day, it is only a quiet lake, where old men play chess beneath the shade and children feed the fish at the water's edge. But at night, when the lanterns along its banks are lit, and the water turns the color of old ink, the lake looks like it is keeping something. And in one telling, it is. Long ago, that country suffered under a long and difficult occupation. There is no need to speak of those years in detail. Only this: a young leader, gentle by nature but determined, wished for nothing more than to see his people live in peace again. One day, while fishing on that very lake, his net came up empty 3 times. On the 4th try, instead of fish, he drew up a sword. Old and plain, unremarkable to look at, but heavier and more certain in his hand than any blade he had held before. He carried it with him from that day. And in one telling, wherever that sword was carried, courage seemed to follow it, the way warmth follows a lit lantern into a dark room. In time, in the way these stories always move toward morning, peace returned to that country. The young leader became something like a father to his people, and the difficult years slowly softened into memory, the way a hard winter softens into the first mild days of spring. One calm evening, not long after peace had settled over the land, he took a small boat out onto that same lake, alone, simply to enjoy the quiet he had fought so long to make possible. The water that evening was perfectly still, not a single ripple. And as he sat there, watching the lanterns begin to glow along the far bank, the water in front of his boat parted, without a sound, and a great golden turtle rose slowly to the surface. It was larger than any turtle he had ever seen, its shell wide and old, its eyes calm and unhurried, as though it had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this quiet evening to arrive. It did not speak, in most tellings. It did not need to. It simply looked at him, and then gently at a sword resting across his lap. And the young leader understood, the way you understand a friend's request, without a single word passing between you. The sword had been lent, not given. And now that its work in the world was finished, it was time, quietly, for it to be returned. He did not hesitate in this telling. He lifted the sword from his lap with both hands, the way you might lift something you had carried so long it had become part of your own arm. And he held it out over the water. The great turtle opened its mouth, unhurried, and took the sword gently between its jaws, and then, without any splash at all, sank back beneath the surface, the sword disappearing with it into the dark green water. The lake closed over the space where it had been, smooth and still, as though nothing at all had happened. The young leader sat alone in his small boat for a long while afterward, in a silence that felt, he said later, less like an ending and more like a kind of blessing. From that evening on, the people called the lake by a new name: Ho Guam, the lake of the returned sword. Not because a weapon had been lost there, but because something borrowed in a hard season had been given back with gratitude, once the hard season had finally, gently, come to an end. The lake is still there, in the middle of that old city, exactly as it was. On very calm evenings, when the water is glass still and the lanterns are lit along the banks, some of the old people say the turtle still rises, just once in a great while. Not to ask for anything, only to look quietly and confirm that the peace it once helped protect is still holding. Some guardians, it seems, live in water so deep and old that even kings must ask them for what they need. Others live in far humbler places. Along the coast, further from any city, where the sea meets the sand each night, and takes back everything it is given. There is a small creature who has kept a much smaller promise for a much longer time without anyone ever asking him to. That story is next. Walk along the coast of that country early enough in the morning before the fishing boats go out, and you may see small mounds of wet sand scattered along the tide line, each one no bigger than a fist. The old people call them Da Trang's mounds, and they say a small crab builds them every single night all along the shore. In one telling, Da Trang was not always a crab. He was a young man, poor but kind-hearted, who one day saved a pair of snakes from a grass fire, carrying them to safety in his own 2 hands without a thought for the risk. The snakes, it turned out, were no ordinary snakes. In gratitude, they gave him a small, glowing pearl and told him that whoever held it could understand the speech of every living creature, the birds, the fish, even the quiet worms turning the soil. Da Trang carried the pearl always, and it changed his life completely. He grew wealthy, listening to fish tell him where the best waters lay. He grew wise, listening to old crows speak of things no man had witnessed. But of everything the pearl gave him, what he loved most was simpler than wealth or wisdom. He loved most of all no longer being alone in a world that was suddenly full of voices. One evening, exhausted from a long day of fishing, Da Trang fell asleep on the sand with the pearl still resting in his open hand. A great sea eagle, drawn by the glow, snatched it from his palm without waking him, and carried it far out over the water, and dropped it, and it sank down, down, into the palace of the Dragon King at the bottom of the sea. Da Trang searched for it for the rest of his life. He dove from every rock along that coast, asking every fish, every current, if they had seen his small glowing light. He grew old doing this, and then, in this telling, he did not stop even after he died. The sea, watching a devotion so patient and so gentle for so many years, could not bear to simply let it end. It kept him, the way the mountain kept the waiting wife, the way the river kept the girl who loved it. It gave him a small, hard shell, and let him stay close to the sand he had searched for so long, so that he might keep looking forever in the only way now left to him. Every night, Da Trang digs small mounds in the wet sand, searching patiently the way he always has. And every morning the tide comes in, gentle and unhurried, and smooths his work away completely. The old people say this is not a punishment. They say the sea simply gives him, each night, a fresh stretch of sand to search, and asks for nothing back except that he keep looking the way he always loved to. So if you walk the shore some early morning and see small mounds of sand scattered along the tide line, already half undone by the water, you are only looking at one night's worth of very patient, very quiet hope. Not every keeper of an old promise lives in water, or earth, or air. One lives further away than the sea itself has ever reached. Our last story tonight takes us all the way up to the moon and to a man who has lived there for the gentlest of reasons. Look up some clear night at the full moon. Not tonight, perhaps, but some night. In that part of the world, people don't see a man's face in the moon the way some other countries do. They see a tree. And beneath it, if you look closely enough, and if the night is clear enough, a man sitting quietly, as he has sat for longer than anyone can remember. They call him Chú Cuội, and this is how he came to be there. Long ago, in one telling, Chú Cuội was a young woodcutter who lived alone at the edge of a forest. He was kind, though a little careless. The sort of man who forgot where he left his axe, but never forgot a kindness done to him. One day, deep in the forest, he came upon a tiger's den and found 4 small cubs, alone, their mother gone. He should have left them, but he was curious and gentle, and he stayed to watch them a while. The mother tiger returned and found him there, and in his fear, Chú Cuội struck her and fled, believing he had killed her. But from a hilltop, hiding, he watched something strange. The tiger, only wounded, dragged herself to a nearby tree and chewed its leaves and pressed them to her wound. And within the hour she rose and walked, healed completely, and gathered her cubs and disappeared into the trees. Chú Cuội understood then that the tree held a kind of magic. He dug it up carefully, roots and all, and carried it home and planted it in his own yard. His neighbor warned him. "Never water this tree with dirty water," she said. "Only clean, only kind water, or the tree will leave you." Chú Cuội used the tree gently and well for many quiet years. He healed a merchant's daughter who had drowned, breathing life back into her with a single leaf. He healed the sick of his village, one after another, asking for nothing in return but the pleasure of their recovered health. He married the merchant's daughter, in time, grateful and gentle, and the 2 of them tended the tree together, carrying clean water from the well each morning, careful never to let anything unclean touch its roots. For a long while, this was enough. A house, a wife, a tree that healed almost anything. A quiet life, tucked at the edge of a forest, much like the wife on the mountain, much like the brothers by the river. But quiet lives in these stories have a way of turning on one small human mistake. One evening, his wife, tired from the day, and thinking little of it, emptied a basin of dirty wash water at the foot of the tree, forgetting, just once, the old warning. The tree shuddered. Its roots began, slowly, to lift from the soil. Chú Cuội came running from the forest just as it happened, and saw his tree, his healing tree, rising gently into the evening air. He did not think. He only reached out, the way you reach for anything you cannot bear to lose, and caught hold of its trunk with both hands. The tree did not stop rising. It carried him with it, up past the tops of the tallest trees, up past the clouds, up into the deep, quiet blue, where the air grows thin and cold, and the whole green world becomes small enough to hold in one hand. His wife called after him, once, from the yard below, but her voice was already very far away. And Chú Cuội, holding tightly to the only thing he had left, simply kept rising, until the earth was only a soft blue light beneath him, and the moon, pale and enormous, opened up around him like a door. He did not fall. He landed gently, in soft gray dust, with his tree beside him, its roots settling into the moon's quiet ground, as though they had always belonged there. The old people say he was not punished, only kept. The way the mountain kept the waiting wife. The way the river kept the girl who loved it. The way the forest kept a voice that refused to stop calling. Some kindness is so complete, it seems that the world simply cannot bear to let it go. And so he remains. On clear nights, when the moon is full and low, you can still see him there. A small dark shape, seated beneath a small dark tree on the pale surface of the moon. Some say he is lonely up there. But the old people, who have told this story the longest, say otherwise. They say he is simply resting, watching over the green earth below, the way the stone watches the river road, the way the water watches the swimmers, the way every quiet guardian in these stories has always watched over the ones it loves. Down below, in the valley, in the village, by the river, under the areca palms, deep in the forest, beside this old still lake, along the quiet shore, the lanterns are going out now, one by one. The rice fields are sleeping under the moonlight. The river moves on, slowly, saying nothing at all. Somewhere, a stone woman still watches a quiet road. Somewhere, a tree and a vine still hold each other by the water. Somewhere, a small brown bird calls once more into the dark, patient as ever. Somewhere, beneath a green river, someone gentle is still keeping watch. Somewhere, beneath still black water, an old turtle sleeps beside an old promise, kept. Somewhere, along a dark shore, a small patient shape is still digging quietly in the wet sand. And somewhere, high above all of it, a woodcutter sits beneath his tree, in the soft gray quiet, and does not mind any more that he cannot come down. The night is very still now. The ink is still wet, and the water has settled